So a leaked State Security Agency report has revealed how the United States obtained intelligence on the country's top political parties, including the ANC, the DA, as well as the EFF and the IFP. The Supreme Court of Appeal on Friday allowed independent media to publish the particulars after an earlier order barred its release. Ian Allis from the Institute of Security Studies says it is a concern how the U.S. communicated the news to the country.
The main purpose of that is, of course, to look after the country of South Africa's interests, but also to look after the citizens of South Africa that are in those countries. So they gather information. There are strict protocols, of course, that have to be followed within the diplomatic circles. So it is not unprecedented. What is actually challenging is the way that they mentioned how they have access to the ruling party, but also to the opposition parties.
Well, let's discuss that issue further, and for that we're joined by criminal law expert Ian Allis. Ian, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, this is an interesting story because it goes back quite a while, actually. It goes all the way back to around October 2022, perhaps even before that, actually. And it wasn't only in October 2022 that the Gauteng High Court had interdicted, that granted that interdict against newspapers and Thabo Makwakwa from publishing that leaked report on intelligence gathered by the U.S. on South African political parties. But your initial thoughts on really what you thought when you first saw it, and what you think this says about who has interest in what goes on in South Africa's political affairs?
Good morning, Naledi, and good morning to the viewers as well. I think our first starting point is that one's got to understand that in terms of international law, there needs to be respect between countries of one another's sovereignty. And including in parts of that is the political sovereignty that a country is entitled to. So the problem that actually has arisen in this aspect, which there needs to be a distinction between almost the legal and the political aspect that's in actual fact crept in on this one. And that's where the problem comes, is that the two have overlapped quite considerably, to the point where you've got political game makers and political agendas already being thought. One can already understand there's a reason for that, but then realistically the reasons need to in actual fact come out. And I think this is where this becomes more groundbreaking, because the actual publishing of how this information is being extracted and what's been taken place and the possible interference with political sovereignty as well as legal sovereignty is of utmost importance.
Yeah, I think what for me, and if we just focus on the legal aspect, because essentially that's really what we can do in this conversation, is just to talk a little bit about how we're able to have this conversation right now, because you've got Judge Tati Makgoka of the Supreme Court of Appeal having overturned that judgment by the Gauteng High Court. And essentially, what he said is that the State Security Agency did not do a good job in observing their duty of utmost faith, claiming that report was claiming that the report was top secret and not secret. Do those details matter? And do they speak to the integrity of our own intelligence then, when we're having discussions about what international intelligence is doing?
Well, it actually does, because if one takes a look, it was a pretty poor attempt by them. Now that everything has come out, for them now to start trying to go ahead and hide those facts and hide the transparency aspect of it. So realistically, they've done a pretty pathetic job, if one could say, of keeping the monitoring and making sure and preserving South Africa's integrity from a legal perspective, and the secrecy on what our information actually is that's been released.
So this is what's come out, and I mean, there's so much to say, and we could certainly have a conversation about what is in that report, which we now know thanks to Judge Tati Makgoka, who is in fact being interviewed today for the post of Justice on the Constitutional Court bench. Essentially, thanks to him, we're able to actually talk about parts of what's come out of that report. In sections of the report, we learn that information is allegedly being gathered by the U.S. consulate in Pretoria and then being shared with U.S. intelligence operatives in the U.S. They've looked into parties like the ANC and particularly around factionalism within the party. I mean, there's so much to talk about here, but is this information that you feel could threaten national security? When you have international agencies looking at, well, this is what the factionalism and divisions look like within the governing party of the country, the main opposition of the country and other parties, is that something that can threaten national security, Ian?
National security, not really.
Okay.
But the political safety of any individual party, that is where it actually lies. This is more about an aspect of self-preservation, the national security, and it is a bit of a playmaking aspect from an international perspective, but it's not going to actually threaten the national security when one country knows fully well what the main political parties and agendas in actual, as well as their opposition's agendas in actual fact are.
Yeah, one would wonder if when we have that political discussion, if it does have an impact at all on what happens on the political landscape of South Africa. But let's talk a little bit about whether or not you're concerned that there could be other countries that are looking into the affairs of political parties in the country. I mean, could it only be the U.S., or could there be possibly other countries that are really looking at the inner workings of political parties, and also to what end?
Oh, there's no doubt there's other countries that are looking at it, because if one looks at it from that scenario, it's basically allies and enemies as well. So realistically, there's always opportunities that are being looked at as who prospective allies would be, what political agendas can in actual fact be, and what they'll be looking at from, if one could almost say, there's a dual aspect from investment both above the board as well as below the board from a criminal enterprises aspect. And that's where specifically, if one looks at a country that looks rife with criminal intent, it gives a lot of countries also an indication from their illegal syndicates to understand where they could possibly go ahead and look at setting up structures and cartels and syndicates. So that's the important aspect from a legal issue, is that national security from a war perspective, no. But from an actual infiltration of illegal enterprises, albeit not a national security level, but it could go ahead and be potentially devastating from a legal aspect on the citizens and what impact they may actually suffer.
Yeah, I think what's concerning about this conversation is then there's the fear that, then if there are possibly other countries that have intelligence agencies looking at the inner workings of political parties, particularly in an election year, what that could mean. But do we have the capacity as South Africa, though, to protect ourselves from those sort of structures doing that sort of inner research, if you will?
Unfortunately not. Realistically, at this juncture, from what has been seen historically with regards with South Africa, and in particular with regards to its political landscape as well as from the legal landscape and the systems that have in actual fact been in place where there has been difficulties and a crumbling of certain aspects of the infrastructure, South Africa doesn't have the resources in actual fact to defend itself. If one could actually say from any intelligence operations being conducted onto it from a legitimate and an illegitimate purpose.
Yeah, South Africans may not have the capacity to protect itself from intelligence work being done on the country, legitimately or illegitimately. Just as we wrap up, of course, the issue back and forth over the past 2 years really has been, Ian, whether or not this report that has found that the U.S. has been it has been collecting intelligence on some of our political parties, whether or not that should be made public. Do you think that information is in the public interest?
Oh, absolutely. That in actual fact is, because realistically we're in an election year. That is, if our own internal structuring isn't of public interest, what is? Because from the people, maybe from the aspect of the Americans and the Europeans or even the Russians, it might not be the biggest thing from an individual aspect of a day-to-day, but rather from a strategic alliance point of view. But from a personal point of view and from the aspect of the South African citizen, it is important and it is of great public interest to know what is in actual fact being planned by our politicians who, whether they're in power at the moment or prospectively going to be in power, what is there or what is their hidden agendas.
Yeah, Ian, we could talk for a very long time about this issue, and I imagine that it will be an ongoing discussion nonetheless. Thank you so much for speaking to us, particularly as we see more and more of that report then being shared with the public. Ian Allis is a criminal law expert speaking.